Good morning, St. Lucia. For those of you who are okay, and we've got that second motion. It is live television, and sometimes these things happen in live productions. I am Lucia Joseph of the Government Information Service. Thank you so much for tuning in. You're watching us on the National Television Network channel 122 on cable television. We're also on the Government of St. Lucia Facebook page and YouTube channels. We're in downtown Castries for the sitting of the Senate today, Thursday, September 16, 2021, and this sitting is following up from the sitting of the House of Assembly. And today, we're going to keep it in line with what has happened in the House of Assembly earlier in the week on Tuesday, when we saw amendments made to the Drugs Prevention and Misuse Bill, as well as Consumer Protection Amendment, the amendment to that bill. Let me say good morning to Prime Minister Hutchinson, who is with us. Bonjour, Primus. It's always a pleasure to be here with you.
And good morning to our viewers here and in the diaspora. Yes, Lisa, the upper house is about to meet to continue the debate and then, I guess, to give the final blessings on the two bills, the drugs prevention of misuse and the consumer protection bill.
And two very important pieces of legislation, Primus, as we know, with the drugs prevention and misuse, and there amendments made to be able to have St. Lucians now have personal possession of up to 30 grams of the cannabis. And that is important because it goes along with the problem that we've had for many, many years now, where you've had individuals having to have records for small quantities, having the possession of small quantities of marijuana.
Of course, the Rastafarian community will be heartened.
Absolutely happy about that. We did have an apology.
And here comes the Sergeant of Arms. And so the session for today's meeting is about to commence.
Good morning, everyone. James chapter 3, verse 13 says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by good conduct, that his works are done in meekness of wisdom." Let us pray. Almighty God, by whom alone kings reign and princes decree justice, and from whom alone cometh all counsel, wisdom, and understanding, we, thine unworthy servants, here gathered together in thy name, do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and to guide us in all our consultations. And grant that we, having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and the happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace, and tranquility of St. Lucia, and uniting and knitting together of the hearts of all persons and estates within the same in true Christian love and charity one towards another. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us now and forevermore. Amen.
Announcements. Senators, I have received correspondence from the Speaker of the House of Assembly advising that the following bills were passed in the House of Assembly and forwarded to the Senate for its comments. The Drugs Prevention and Misuse Amendment, the Consumer Protection Amendment. Also, I have received an excuse from Senator Noorani Aziz informing that he is unavailable for today's sitting. Statements from ministers. Bills. Honorable Parliamentary Secretary, Ministry of Tourism, Investment, Creative Industries, Culture and Information, and Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I beg to present the first reading of a bill shortly entitled Drugs Prevention and Misuse Amendment.
Drugs Prevention of Misuse Amendment.
Leader of Government Business.
Mr. President, I move for the suspension of Standing Order 49-2 to allow this bill to go through its remaining stages at this sitting.
Senators, the question is that Standing Order number 49-2 is suspended in order to allow the Leader of Government Business to proceed with the remaining stages of the bill at this sitting. I now put the question. As many as are of this opinion, say aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. You may leave is granted. You may proceed, Honorable Senator.
Mr. President, I beg to use a second reading of a bill shortly entitled Drugs Prevention and Misuse Amendment. Mr. President, before I proceed with the contents of this bill, I beg your leave to welcome back and wish all our students a productive term back at school, albeit virtually. I also wish to join the rest of St. Lucia and other colleagues who spoke before me recently in expressing condolences to the family of Valerie, the late Valerie Albert Favre, a stalwart in the broadcasting and cultural fraternity, and coming from the Ministry of Tourism, Culture, Creative Industries. It would be remiss of me if we didn't do so. I also want to express words of comfort to a number of people from the community where I'm from. I do not wish to go into too much detail there, who are suffering a loss of their loved ones, but just to single out the family of one of my classmates from kindergarten, Dion Thomas, who is mourning the loss of both of her parents, I wish the family all the best and the comfort that we can provide at this time. Mr. President, this bill, the Drug Prevention of Misuse Amendment, the amendments that we're proposing to make to this bill, first has quite a lot of historical significance. And in my deliberations this morning, I intend to provide that context and attempt to justify the reason we are here today. Mr. President, historically, it has been necessary, we found it necessary to seek to eliminate some of the many prejudices, if we can call it, that have existed in our society in this post-colonial. These prejudices are not specific to drugs and drug amendments, but in almost every sphere. And I think before we seek to speak to the specific amendments of this bill, I want to make it very clear to us, Mr. President, that this bill is consistent with the broader philosophy of the St. Lucia Labour Party, of which I am a part, a philosophy that embraces inclusion and embraces all groups, social classes, irrespective of gender, class, race, and association. And so this bill seeks to manifest that overall philosophy. As stated in our manifesto, Mr. President, we promised that we were going to expunge from the criminal records of St. Lucians persons who were convicted for less than 30 grams of cannabis. And we are here to do so, just as we have delivered on the promise to remove facilities fees for 14,000 families in this country. And we will be back, Mr. President, to deliver on several other promises that we made during the last election campaign. Mr. President, this is the first stage of a broader cannabis policy and the first phase of improving a broader regulatory framework for drug prevention and misuse, as well as expanding and doing some serious work in the cannabis industry. Now, we must not forget the origin of this piece of legislation, Mr. President. Allow me to just mention briefly that its origin lies in this Labour Party. Its origin can be traced as far back as 2 or 3 administrations, if we can call it, of the Labour Party. And as was correctly pointed out by a former Prime Minister of this country, Dr. Anthony, the work that started on this bill was championed by Dr. Rosemary Antoine, who chaired the CARICOM Cannabis Commission on that matter. And I want to acknowledge the work that was done there, as well as the work that was put in by the former government, but had not been completed. And so today, Mr. President, we are here to complete the task that was started. And I'm very happy and very proud to be part of that effort. Perhaps a little more fortunate that it is coming at a time when I am part of the government. So I see it as also a privilege, Mr. President. In previous sittings, and in fact, in the sitting of this Honorable Senate, we came to expunge criminal records, from criminal records, persons who had been convicted. And today, we are taking it a step further. Like I said, Mr. President, we will be back to continue the discussion on a broader policy framework for this type of legislation. Mr. President, we believe in this government. We believe as a country that it is important to demonstrate to people who have faltered that there is something called second chances, that there is something called another opportunity, that because you've erred once or twice, because you may have been weak and made an error, that your life is not doom and gloom and it's not all over. Mr. President, we believe that we can remove certain impediments on the lives of young men and women in this country who languish at the Bodily Correctional Facility because they made a simple error. We are not going to say that it's okay to do things that you shouldn't do, but there are times when you need a second chance. And Mr. President, we believe also that a lot of these young people were from a specific social group or a specific sector, specific group of people which forms the Rastafarian community. And I believe that community has suffered tremendously because of some of those, if I may call them, prejudice legislation. And so, while others may have gotten away with a lot more serious crimes, if you call them, or serious breaches of our laws, this specific group of people have suffered. Some of them have been languishing in prison, and as we know, their criminal records will be required when they seek to move on in life, and they are deprived of important opportunities to contribute to the development of this country and to contribute to their own personal development. Mr. President, I heard the Prime Minister apologize to the Rastafarian community for their sufferings, and I think it was a very appropriate gesture. But I tell them that as we go along in the next few years, we'll do a little bit more than apologizing. We will be making sure that we include them in the communication and in the conversations that we have about development in this country. We're not leaving anyone out, Mr. President. Mr. President, like many of our colleagues stated before, I would not stand here and say that I'm a smoker, nor do I would stand here and say that I particularly indulge in any activity that puts any threat on my health, i.e. drinking alcohol and so on. But smoking, particularly of marijuana, has been part of our existence in this country forever. And there is no secret that it is part of the economic and socio-cultural framework or the socio-cultural background of this country. And I believe, Mr. President, that while some of us may not indulge in that, we have to accept that some of the things that were considered to be illegal have really created unnecessary stress on people, on law enforcement, and on the government as a whole. And we can relieve them of that and make it a little more progressive in the way we operate. Mr. President, we can also point out that there are more affluent groups in this society who have been able to enjoy some of the benefits, if you like, of indulging in the use of cannabis with no consequence. However, some cannot. And I think it's not equitable, it's not fair if some can and some cannot. And then there needs to be some level of equity and fairness brought to this. Mr. President, we believe that this bill is not just a straightforward bill. It's not as simple as it sounds. It may excite a lot of people, but there are some serious implications to this bill being passed and this cannabis discussion that we are having when it becomes law. Mr. President, we believe that there are some social, economic, socio-cultural implications with the very passing of this piece of legislation. And as a responsible government, Mr. President, we will not just go about doing this without paying attention to the possible implications and seek to address those even before the problems that we anticipate will come up. And so we believe that there is need for education. As we come to this House to request and to seek the support of our colleagues for this piece of legislation, we acknowledge that there is need for education. And a very broad perspective, I may say, when I speak of education. Let me just point out some of those, Mr. President. A number of educational opportunities exist with this piece of legislation. One of them is that we need to change the false perceptions that exist about cannabis and users of cannabis. That has to change. I remembered, Mr. President, growing up as a child, and as boys, we used to play a game called Police versus Rasta. I don't know if any of us remember that. Police versus Rasta. In the rural communities, we had a lot of space to run around, so we would run around and play Police versus Rasta. And as a child, I always opted to be one of the policemen in playing that game. Never chose to be Rastafarian. You know why, Mr. President? Because in my mind as a young child, it was taboo, it was a bad thing to be Rastafarian. So I thought I would have a little more, I would have an advantage in playing the game if I was a police officer. So I would get to arrest all the Rastas who run around and mimic smoking. And even as a child, that socialization process taught us that there are certain groups that were better than others. And being part of certain groups, you have an advantage. And at that time, Rastafarian, for me as a child, was perceived to be a bad group. But it is only over time, with the evolution of education and development and enlightenment, that I realized that being Rastafarian is not necessarily being bad. It is just a different way of life. And there are lots of very good things that we can learn from the discipline and the values and the practices of these people. And so, Mr. President, I think that education needs to be made relevant and available to every single St. Lucian. Because I think we do not want our children growing up now thinking that certain people, because of their practices, are any less important than other groups. And that is why we seek to ensure that we pay attention to the implications. So education, Mr. President, about false perceptions has to be put up front. We also believe, Mr. President, that the stigmatization and the stereotypes that came with certain groups must be put away. We believe that just because people look differently, they wear their dreadlocks, and they believe certain things are more important. For example, in their religious practices, some of us go to church and we kneel down and we take communion, while others chant and they smoke, that there is something wrong with these groups. We need to embrace inclusion and tolerance and coexistence. And we believe that such legislation, Mr. President, can bring together people of different groups and different practices to coexist and to respect each other. Mr. President, I also believe that there needs to be education on the general idea of substance abuse. And that is, in the foreseeable future, because of this piece of legislation, I believe, and I believe I can speak on behalf of the rest of my colleagues, we believe that if you are going to allow for the use of cannabis, albeit in smaller quantities, there would probably be an increase in consumption, an increase in the use. And if that is going to happen, you must have a clear policy that helps people understand that just because something is available does not mean that you must abuse it, overindulge, or be irresponsible in using it. And so there needs to be education, Mr. President, on substance abuse, not only the use of cannabis, but the use of any substance that can cause harm or that can create a problem for you. And so, Mr. President, that education needs to be extended to substance abuse. We also believe, and as was stated by my colleagues in the lower house, that there needs to be a very clear message about smoking and using marijuana, particularly for smoking in public spaces, as well as cigarettes and any other form of smoking. Because we do not want the St. Lucian public to believe that just because they are allowed to have a certain quantity of cannabis in their possession, that it is licensed to just blaze away in any public space, whether it be cannabis, whether it be cigarettes, whether it be hemp, or any other substance. We want to ensure that there are clear guidelines regarding smoking and smoking in public, full stop. Mr. President, we have to also recognize that there needs to be education to highlight the medicinal benefits of cannabis. Because I think way back and until recently, most of us who knew about marijuana, cannabis, the herb, whichever way we choose to call it, all we used to associate it with is smoking. But we have learned that there are serious medicinal benefits, therapeutic value in the use of this once it is done in a controlled manner and the scientific practices are put in place. So the education must extend to the benefits of the use of marijuana and not just the medicinal benefits, sorry, and not just the social benefits or what we call the high. President, if I can continue on the line of education, I have been an educator almost all of my life, and I think we have in this Honorable Senate a high percentage of our members who may have been teachers or educators at some point in their lives. I also recognize a student in this Honorable Chamber. And Mr. President, I want to make it very, very clear that while we are here to make the amendment to this piece of legislation, we have to be very clear to parents, teachers, community, stakeholders, students, particularly those under the age of 18, that under no circumstances will we as a government encourage or think that it's okay for people under the age of 18 to indulge in smoking of any kind or use of any substance that is not meant for their consumption. As I always say, Mr. President, and I think our parents would say so, there are activities for adults and there are activities for children. And certain things we must accept are not for children to indulge in. And so I implore the Department of Education, our social workers, our healthcare practitioners, our parents, and all other persons who interact with young children and people under the age of 18, our youth councils, the National Youth Council and other youth and sports development organizations in the communities, to make sure that we have a very clear understanding that this is not meant for children or people under the age of 18, just as we would encourage for the consumption of alcohol or the use of cigarettes or any other banned substance. Mr. President, I also believe that there are certain conditions that must be made clear about the use of cannabis, particularly when it comes to people using it in their private dwelling. I want to take a couple of minutes, Mr. President, to bring to the attention of this Honorable House some news that came out yesterday from the BBC, from the World Anti-Doping Agency. One of the colleagues, my colleagues in the lower house, made mention of WADA, W-A-D-A, the World Anti-Doping Agency, still having cannabis listed as a banned substance, and that is true. And being from a sports background, I remembered in my days as a football administrator, having had to deal with a number of our athletes when we sought to have them make the national team and travel and so on, that they had to be subjected to those tests. And a lot of them were very nervous because unfortunately many of them were users of marijuana. Today it remains illegal. However, I read some refreshing news yesterday, Mr. President, that came out from a BBC publication, that the World Anti-Doping Agency is going to do a scientific review next year, 2022, to determine whether cannabis should remain a banned substance. Now, that's good news. I think we now can see that we are moving in the same direction with the rest of the world. Yesterday morning, and we can check the source, the BBC, the publication was saying or declared that in 2022, WADA is going to have a scientific review to determine whether cannabis should remain on the banned list or should be removed. So we are very much in line with what's going on around the world. However, Mr. President, I want to remind St. Lucians that as we speak, cannabis is still a banned substance. So for our athletes out there who hear this news, it doesn't mean that you will be able to participate in the Olympics, World Cup qualifiers, represent your country, and you will be excused if marijuana is found in your urine and in your blood tests. So I just want to be very clear. While it's good news that hopefully next year WADA will say we no longer have marijuana as a banned substance, that will open up great opportunities for athletes in St. Lucia, in Jamaica, Barbados, the entire Eastern Caribbean. But Africa for sure, I believe that we must remind people that it is still illegal. So meanwhile, our athletes, please do not indulge if you have aspirations of going far with your development. So, Mr. President, I want to now make the point that our intention here is not to make indiscriminate smoking or any of these things legal, but it is to remove the discrimination that exists. Mr. President, if I can quickly look at some of the sections that were specific to this bill. If we look at Schedule 2 of the bill, it says that pursuant to the Act, a person found in possession of the, to be in possession if the person has a quantity of 15 or more of cannabis or cannabis resin. Further, according to the Act, the prosecution and punishment of such possession attracts a summary conviction of a maximum term of imprisonment for 3 years or fine not exceeding $100,000. In addition, Mr. President, if a person found with a quantity of more than 15 grams of cannabis in his or her possession, that person is in possession of a controlled drug, and for that purpose, and for the purpose of supplying it to another and contravening the Act, and this is a separate offense from simple possession, and as such carries a separate penalty. So there are 2 different penalties. And that penalty will attract 3 to 14 years of imprisonment. So, Mr. President, I think that what this bill does is that it removes, it amends that condition to allow decriminalizing not from 15 to 30, but from up to 30 grams. So it gives a little bit more latitude in terms of the quantity of marijuana that is allowed. But of course, it goes on to say that there are restrictions, and the restrictions related to possession. And I'll read an example there. Firstly, a person is prohibited from smoking cannabis in public spaces, which I have mentioned, bars and so on. And the conviction is a fine not exceeding $1,500. So you can see there is a difference in the sum of money that you are liable to pay if you're found guilty. So, Mr. President, I want to wrap up now and just remind this Honorable House that one of the things I tend to do, if you go through any of my presentations from 2016 in this Honorable House, is that I encourage the idea of best practice. Whether it's in education, in healthcare, in sports, in COVID management, in any practice in this country, I always speak to best practice, because I think that is something that all countries can benefit from. And I just draw the attention of this House to countries in the region who have moved ahead of us in terms of their amendments with cannabis legislation. Jamaica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua, to name 3 of them. And my observations, Mr. President, while I was out sometime in 2018 in the US, in Denver, Colorado, it was very interesting what I observed. In this state, there was a very clear marketing, merchandising, and commercializing package that I noticed with cannabis. And it tells us that there are lucrative business opportunities for us as a country if we can manage this well. I believe also in time to come we need to start speaking to the issue of cultivation. I think there were questions raised about how people are going to acquire the 30 grams. So we need to speak to cultivation. We need to speak to the issue of whether we will allow people to have a certain number of plants in their yards. That discussion is a discussion we must not be afraid to have, because you have to be able to tell people if they can have it for medical purposes and they can use it, where they're going to get it from. So, Mr. President, I believe that commercialization and the development of the entire industry is the conversation we need to have going forward. And so, when we get to that point, we have to make sure at all times that if we get to the point of cultivation, as was suggested by one of our colleagues, that we protect the interests of the most vulnerable people, and that's our small farmers, our people who are unable to go into big commercializing industry from the onset. So as a government of inclusion, we have to make sure that the amendments made to this bill look after the interests of all groups. Nobody is going to be allowed to violate other people, but there needs to be a certain level of responsibility for users as well as respect for non-users of marijuana. So, Mr. President, present this bill with the amendments that we will propose for the blessings of this House, and hope that it will bring some measure of fairness and equity to the community, Rastafarian community particularly, and St. Lucians who are desirous of making use of the holy herb, as we call it, called cannabis. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senators, the question is that the Drugs Prevention and Misuse Amendment Bill will be read a second time. Senator Farrer.
Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, please permit me to extend sincere condolences to the Jacobs family on the passing of their loved one, Arthur Jacobs, and we know that this was one of our cultural icons. Our sympathies, the sympathies of the opposition, are with the family. Mr. President, the need for regulatory reform related to cannabis or marijuana has been a lot more urgent in recent years, as many citizens and various sectors in society and and of course, in keeping with global trends, clamor for the decriminalization of the drug. And we understand, Mr. President, the move towards this end. It is for this reason that in 2019, July 2019, the St. Lucia Cannabis Commission was established. And this committee, or representative body of key stakeholders, was given a mandate to hold various consultations, review and make recommendations to the then government on the laws and the regulations as it relates to cannabis and the potential cannabis industry. So while I applaud this government for having taken the step, the first step in regularizing the possession of a small quantity of cannabis, I wish, Mr. President, to register on record some of our concerns regarding this bill. The bill for consideration, Mr. President, only deals with one, or should I say, a minute aspect of it, of the act, the broader act. For example, the proposed amendment to Section 8 gives persons much needed relief. And I know that many of our St. Lucians are quite happy with that. Relief with the quantity of cannabis that they are now allowed to have in their possession. So now, if one is found to have 30 grams of cannabis or marijuana, that is about one ounce, or 1.06 ounce to be exact, or less, in their possession, in his or her possession, then he or she will not be arrested by the police. Mr. President, we want to ensure that this is the correct message and interpretation that the people of St. Lucia have where this bill is concerned. And so, Mr. President, I am happy with that. However, this is by no means suggesting that marijuana is now legalized in St. Lucia or decriminalized, for that matter. Mr. President, it is very important for us to make that point abundantly clear. And you know why, Mr. President? There are many who are of the view that the police can no longer arrest them for possession of marijuana. This is the perception that some of them have. And I've heard it. Pièce police passe à à présent. Marijuana legalized, government legalized marijuana. And I'm happy that the leader of government business, he was careful enough, Mr. President, to highlight some of the caveats and some of the misperceptions that need to be corrected. And so we have to be very, very careful how this bill is enacted and enforced. Mr. President, I just want to use a hypothetical example. So if Tommy, I'm not saying that Tommy is somebody in St. Lucia who uses cannabis or who smokes cannabis. It's just an example. If Tommy is caught with about 60 grams of marijuana, 2 ounces, or say 1 pound, which would be about 453 grams. He, that is Tommy, according to the law, commits an offense. So clearly, this bill does not make provisions for the legalization of marijuana or its resin as many would have imagined. And I just want to reiterate, because Mr. President, this is a bill that many have been waiting for. It is a piece of legislation that certain sectors of the society have been clamoring for, and we need to ensure that the interpretation is synonymous, or it is equivalent to what is actually stated in the document. Having said that, Mr. President, the bill gives no consideration to the cultivation of the 30 grams or the 1 ounce of cannabis or less that Tommy is allowed to have in his possession. Does it really make sense? And we are told, Mr. President, that the government will return to the House perhaps to consider cultivation. But it does not make logical sense at this point, Mr. President, to allow someone to have in his or her possession 30 grams of marijuana, but according to the Principal Act, it is still unlawful. It is still a crime for persons to cultivate any plant of the genus cannabis. Kiko te yo kaitwape 30 grams la. Kiko te yo kaitwape yon zos. I would be happy, Mr. President, if the leader of government business would explain, not just to me or to the Senate, but explain to St. Lucians who are listening, the key stakeholders, those interest groups, explain to them where the 30 grams or 1 ounce of cannabis or less will be obtained. Mr. President, I suggest that this government takes a closer look at the recommendation made by the National Cannabis Commission on page 103 of the report that clusters minimum age, personal possession quantity, and home cultivation restrictions. These three come together. I do not think, Mr. President, it makes logical sense for this government to pass legislation regarding the decriminalization of a specific quantity of cannabis, but gives no consideration to cultivation of the same allowable quantity. And this is the very same sentiment that is expressed by many in society. It's a good bill, good initiative. We need to move with the times, but we need to be very careful how this is enacted. Mr. President, I am wondering whether the amendments to this bill have sufficiently satisfied the Rastafarian community and others who use cannabis for medicinal, personal, religious reasons. Whether they bake it, steam it, boil it or smoke it. As the Jamaican reggae artist Richie Spice would say. I'm not convinced, Mr. President. After having taken a cursory look at the Cannabis Commission report, it's revealed that based on the recommendations on page 5, we need to take a look at the report. And the final paragraph, which reads, smoking of cannabis should be banned in public spaces, and we see that reflected in the bill, with appropriate exceptions for Rastafarians on religious grounds. The consultations, a lot of the work that had to be done prior to us being here today, that has taken place. Recommendations have been made. Lots of stakeholders, agencies were involved. And those recommendations must be carefully considered. But when I look at the bill, Mr. President, under the new section 27A, restriction of smoking cannabis in a public space or public place, couldn't a clause be inserted to reflect the recommendation made by the Cannabis Commission to allow Rastafarians to smoke their herb in the designated areas of worship or for religious reasons? I'm asking the question. Members of that community depend on their ganja or their herb as part of their spiritual rite and sacrament. It's part of the culture. We understand that. I can only imagine, Mr. President, that consideration would have been given to the Rastafarian community, particularly since the Ayanola Council for the movement of Rastafari was represented on that Cannabis Commission. And why the fragmented approach taken by this government in addressing cannabis? Why? Mr. President, is there an underlying motive? I have to ask. Are we trying to satisfy a specific group, a target group, a specific sector? You see, Mr. President, the United Workers' Party administration has always looked at the bigger picture. And in this case, it would serve this government well if it took a more methodical and meticulous approach to this bill. One that would take into consideration public education and health campaigns to minimize the potential health risks and home cultivation restrictions of the allowable quantity. Not having to return to the house to do that. It will be enacted. There are lots of misperceptions. The Hansard, Mr. President, is not what will be enforced. It is the bill, the legislation. And if there was need, you recognize the need, the leader of government business, and this government recognized that there was need for education. And some of those concerns that have been mentioned to be addressed through public education and health campaigns Mr. President, to me it would make sense for that to be reflected in the bill. Not in the detail that he provided, but the education, the health campaigns, because children, there are many children, Mr. President, who are already of the perception that, hey, this is a license for me to smoke. So we need to address this carefully. Mr. President, the bill as it stands is inadequate, and for the reasons that I have already articulated. Notwithstanding what has been presented by the leader of the opposition, the leader of government business, I'm taking you back there. I do apologize. Mr. President, I am of the conviction that this bill would receive tremendous support had considerations been given to those other areas previously outlined. My trepidation, Mr. President, regarding this fragmented approach and the manner in which the proposed bill will be enacted and enforced and I don't think it's just me or the opposition, Mr. President, because there are many who are a bit anxious about the way in which this bill is going to be, or this piece of legislation will be enforced. I just hope that this government is not taking a gingerly step towards creating an environment in which lawlessness will thrive. Having said that, Mr. President, as a whole, the initiative is one we support, but we need to emphasize that this must be done with caution. I thank you, and these are my observations, Mr. President.
Senators, Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just permit me make some short remarks with regard to the bill this morning, the Drugs Prevention and Misuse Amendment Act. Mr. President, this has been hailed by a number of persons in a number of different spheres as a historic day, an historic piece of legislation. And I would like to begin my presentation, perhaps, by going back before addressing the specific terms of this act and raising one or two little issues that I have with some of the contents of it. Among the persons of the wider world, Mr. President, the Caribbean is often associated with sun, sea, sand, and weed, if we're being honest. The stereotypical presentation of Caribbean or West Indian persons in popular film, in popular music, is often as a happy-go-lucky, locks-wearing, not a Rastafarian, but locks-wearing weed smoker. There are many things that are offensive about that portrayal, but perhaps one of the most offensive things about it is that it obscures and it trivializes the historical relationship between the West Indian persons and cannabis, marijuana, ganja, weed, whatever you want to call it. The history of cannabis, if we look at it closely, okay, is a metaphor for and mirrors in a number of ways the Caribbean experience and the Caribbean history. It might surprise many of us to learn that cannabis is not endemic to the Caribbean. It's a transplant brought here, like so many of our ancestors, as part of the colonial history of the Caribbean. It was brought to West Indies by indentured servants from India who had used it medicinally and for his religious practice for a number of centuries before it was brought to the Caribbean. The prohibition and the persecution of cannabis is the story of colonial and imperial exploitation, oppression, social, economic, and even racial discrimination. It is not by chance, Mr. President, that locally cultivated and easily accessible psychoactive substance, which was primarily associated with and used by persons of color, has been banned, while highly processed, often externally obtained psychoactive alcoholic products are freely accessible, legal, and often encouraged, I would dare say. I'm sure we've all had experiences in talking to police officers and just viewing stories of the war on drugs and the expense and the effort that has gone into combating cannabis cultivation in the region. I don't know how many of us here trek or hike, and I've seen some of the places where these plantations are grown. They are highly inaccessible. It's taken a lot of effort for these persons to go and cultivate them in these areas. And it's also taken a lot of effort to find and eradicate them. These resources, I would submit, could perhaps have been better used doing other areas of police and law enforcement. For decades, the Drugs Misuse and Prevention Act, and particularly the areas which affect cannabis use, unfairly targeted a strata of our society. For decades, it has led to the incarceration and criminalization of a particular class and category of persons. It has robbed these young men of the ability to contribute productively to society, and by extension, it has robbed us as a whole of their talents and their potential. They've been rotting, for want of a better expression, in bodily. And so, in a number of ways, this legislation or this piece of legislation is long overdue. Permit me to share a personal experience, professional experience of just how unfair this legislation has been in practice. Prior to entering private practice, I was fortunate enough to serve for a number of years with the Attorney General's chambers. One of the duties of the Attorney General's chambers is to address and deal with constitutional motions and habeas corpus applications. The last bit of litigation that I did before leaving chambers was a habeas corpus application by my learned friend Andy George on behalf of a young man who had been incarcerated for almost a year And the circumstance of his incarceration really caused us to pause. And we did not object to the application. In summary, this is what had happened. This young man, who was gainfully employed with one of the media houses in St. Lucia, went to attend a party in his neighborhood. As often happens, a disagreement arose between some of the persons in the party. He was not part of that disagreement. The police were called. In typical fashion, they decided to search everyone who was in the vicinity. He was searched and was found to have a single joint in his possession. He was arrested. He was incarcerated on remand, as I indicated, for up there. He was unable to meet his bail conditions and so was languishing, despite the fact that he had no previous convictions, no criminal record, was gainfully employed and actively supported, fortunately up to that time, by his employer. And so, if it was not for the intervention of Mr. George to make the habeas corpus application, because for whatever reason, the prosecution was not moving forward, this young man, who for any other assessment would have been a valuable and member of society, would have been forced to languish indefinitely at Her Majesty's prison, or Bordelais, in fact, sorry. And if we contrast that with the experience, because I'm sure, again, and I'm generalizing, most of us know persons who are of a certain echelon in society, who are regarded as professional, who live at a certain well-to-do area, who use cannabis with impunity, without fear of being arrested, without fear of being incarcerated, and oftentimes publicly. But yet still, persons who hail from other places live with that fear and that stigma of being arrested, tried, and convicted. This to address that balance somewhat, and therefore it's a welcome legislative change. But as I noted earlier on, it is long overdue. Jamaica first decriminalized cannabis use in 2015. It is more than half a decade later, and we are only now approaching this. I am also cognizant that, as has been said, I think, on both sides, it is now becoming acceptable internationally to do this. We are not setting a trend. We are not taking decisions based primarily on our own internal assessment of what's going on. If we are to be honest with ourselves, we are largely jumping on a train that has left the station. The United States, Canada, and several of the international developed countries have decriminalized, and in some cases are moving quite swiftly to legalization of cannabis. As I indicated, the fight against cannabis was largely due to colonial and imperial forces. And those very same forces that forced us in a number of ways to criminalize our own people have now changed their tact and are forcing us to follow their path. Turning specifically to the bill, Mr. President, I note that Clause 4, which adds the new Section 8A, makes provision for possession of 30 grams or less of cannabis or cannabis resin. And as Senator Polius indicated, whereas this allows persons to have a certain amount of cannabis in their possession lawfully, there is no provision for where they are to get this cannabis from. Section 5 of the Parent Act still makes it illegal to import cannabis or cannabis resin. And similarly, Section 9 of the Act makes it unlawful to grow any genus of the cannabis plant. I would have hoped that in the interim between the first reading before the lower house and it's coming back to the lower house, that some step would have been made to include personal cultivation. The Act in Antigua is a clear example where persons are allowed, each household is allowed 4 plants for personal use, personal, spiritual, religious use. This is an easy amendment that could have been made to this bill to make its operation that much more complete. But additionally, Mr. President, it creates a little bit of a conundrum for the police, practically. Because as I've noted, it is still illegal to import, it is still illegal to grow. So when you come upon an individual with cannabis in their possession, whereas it might not be lawful for them, it's not, illegal for them to have it in their possession, there is still evidence of two crimes being committed. What is that police officer now to do? Does he ignore the fact that there may be importation of cannabis? Or does he ignore the fact that there may be cultivation of cannabis? It puts law enforcement in an awkward and, I'm sure, unwelcomed position. And so, Mr. President, I would urge the government side to please address this as soon as possible. I note Clause 6 of the bill, which introduces the restriction on smoking cannabis in a public place. And I endorse and support that. I believe we've all come to understand that secondhand smoking is oftentimes worse than smoking yourself, and that persons ought to be able to enjoy their environment in an manner. Oh, I skipped Clause 5, which deals with treatment programs for young children. And I support again this. I believe that drug use should be treated primarily as what it is, which is a public health issue, rather than criminalization. And so I support the attempts to ensure that young persons are entered into treatment programs when they are found with cannabis punished. I also support the stated by the leader of government business that education is and has to form part of the underlying policy of the decriminalization. It has to be made clear to persons that it's not a free-for-all. You're not able to just smoke when and how you want. And although cannabis is generally seen to be a healthier alternative to tobacco, there are still inherent risks in smoking any substance whatsoever, as well as the developing brains of young persons. There are risks involved in partaking in cannabis at a young age. And so education must be an essential part of the rollout of this bill, or the operationalization, of this bill. Senator Polius also noted, and I can't help but repeat it, that it is a little odd that there is no specific provision or acknowledgement of the Rastafarian faith. We are all going to congratulate them on their role in terms of educating persons on the benefits of cannabis, such as they are, and also practicing their religion and their faith. But there is no recognition of the fact that, one, as Senator Polius pointed out, they may be required to use it in an otherwise public space as part of their religious practices, as well as the fact that they may need more than 30 grams for those religious practices. Again, the Antigua legislation, I think, is an example of how to address this, although it's addressed in the Cannabis Bill as opposed to the Misuse of Drugs Act. But it does make specific exception and recognition of the Rastafarian faith and the practices which are involved in the Rastafarian faith. And again, I would like to commend to the government side that they make those necessary amendments so that we don't just pay lip service to the struggle of the Rastafarians, to their experience in fighting for their right to worship freely, but that we take the necessary steps. And it's worth noting that in other countries, constitutional challenges to the prohibitions on Rastafarians using cannabis for their religious practices have been upheld. So let us take in front, as they say, and address these issues before they become more significant. I would like to encourage the government to move swiftly to enacting a more comprehensive legislation to address cannabis, cannabis use, and the cannabis or the creation of a cannabis industry. And part of that is because if we are going to be serious about developing an industry, we have to do it quickly. St. Lucia does not have a reputation as a cannabis producer. We are not Jamaica, we are not St. Vincent. So we are going to be entering a market which has, quite frankly, already developed significantly internationally at a late stage. The longer we delay, the less benefit we are going to derive from entering this industry. We must be sure that when we do so, we protect as much as possible the local farmers and the local industry. I think if we look at the experience, particularly in the US and Canada, very quickly after decriminalization or legalization of cultivation, you saw very big companies moving in and pushing out the small man. We cannot allow that to happen here. It cannot be a situation where we remain as primary producers, where we are just landers who are just planting things to export to someone else to then re-import at a later stage. We have to engage in the research. We have to engage in the value added to ensure that we derive the benefits from this product, which grows easily in our fertile soil. We need as well to embrace cannabis tourism. We need not to be hypocritical about things. It's either we're going to go into this and do it fully and commit to it, or we are going to take half steps, in which case we are just going to be appeasing our sense of, we're doing something to assist persons, but not really achieve any real developmental goals as a result. And finally, Mr. President, permit me to sound a note of warning to persons who partake in cannabis, in marijuana, in weed, in ganja, whatever you want to call it. The medical profession over the last few years in St. Lucia has been sounding the warning of increasing incidences of COPD. There are too many young, otherwise able-bodied young men who are suffering from this debilitating disease. And it is a debilitating disease. There's nothing pleasant about suffering and struggling to breathe. And the medical professionals have noted that a primary cause of this COPD in young persons is mixing marijuana and tobacco. So with your leave, Mr. President, I don't know how many young persons, unfortunately, listen to the Senate, but I would like to really urge them, if you are going to partake in cannabis, if you're going to partake in marijuana, after yourself, do not mix marijuana and tobacco. It's a deadly combination and it kills. With that, Mr. President, I support this bill. Thank you.
Honorable Parliamentary Secretary in the Ministry of Education, Sustainable Development, Innovation, Science, Technology, and Vocational Training.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I seek leave to extend a successful school year to all students and teachers in our education system. Mr. President, I am aware of the challenge, but they have shown their resolve and resilience and have always performed excellently. Mr. President, I wish that you would also allow me to extend condolences to the families who have lost loved ones. I remember in particular Mrs. Valerie Albert Fevrier, who made her contribution to the education system. And I know young people will remember Nancy's challenge. My son was one of the winners of Nancy's challenge, and he has taken this very hard. Mr. President, I have never smoked and have no intention of smoking because of my knowledge of the dangers of smoking. Mr. President, I cannot forget the coughing that accompanies smoking, and this has always scared me. Mr. President, the values of my parents are still etched on my mind, and I never succumbed to peer pressure and never tried it when I was offered. This is because, Mr. President, at secondary school age, I interacted with Rastafarians from my community and witnessed young Rastafarians smoke in their own space and practice their rituals. Mr. President, these were young, intelligent young men, some of whom had left university and had done well, but were not accepted in society. They had so much to offer us, but were cast aside because they did not conform to the norms of the society. Mr. President, my former students would certainly not associate me with the support of a bill of this nature because as a teacher, as a school principal, as an educator, I discourage them against the use and possession of drugs. And many a time I had to intervene to protect them from being used as donkeys in the trafficking process. Mr. President, I stand in support of this bill because it gives adults and not minors the liberty of possession of not more than 30 grams of cannabis. Mr. President, as anything else, it is anticipated that these adults will conform and use their respective respect the space of others and respect the health of others and use the cannabis in their own space and not in public. Mr. President, the reality is that there are adults who smoke, whether it is cigarette, whether it's tobacco, which is legal and readily available, cannabis that has been illegal, or other drugs with similar adverse effects. We are also aware that increasingly, many countries in the world are gradually becoming more tolerant towards the use of cannabis and are moving in the direction of legalization. Mr. President, change is inevitable. It was the Greek philosopher Heraclitus who said that change is the only constant in life. It means that the world is always changing, and so are people. Not only is change always happening, but it is unavoidable. Mr. President, This reminds me of the time when young unmarried teachers of St. Lucia were fired if they were pregnant. Fathered children were not fired. Since this draconian law was repealed, the public has moved on. Probably we don't even remember that this law existed. And I always say my mom was not a teacher, but very happy and pleased that I am the child of an unmarried woman, a single mother. Mr. President, similarly, it was a process of change. It is a process. It is not a one shot. It is not everything that we can do in one shot. Slavery was not abolished in one day. It was a process. And so I want everyone to understand that this is a process. Probably those of us around here are okay with it, but we still have many members of the public who are still not happy that marijuana will, or there's an intention to legalize marijuana because of our history, of our culture, of what we have known to accept in society. I think we have to be very cautious and we have to take it in stride. And I really don't see why some of us are so hasty to get marijuana legalized within the first 6 weeks of the reign of the St. Lucia Labour Party, when 5 years ago there was so much time to legalize marijuana. Mr. President, history will record that this change in our statutes occurred under a St. Lucia Labour Party government. Mr. President, we make things happen instead of constantly complaining. Mr. President, I wish to reiterate that this bill seeks to give adults the right to possession and use of not more than 30 grams of cannabis. And we know very well that cannabis is available, and we know very well that people smoke cannabis in St. Lucia every day. I will ask the question, where have they been getting it from? Mr. President, cannabis remains illegal for minors to buy, or any drug remains illegal for minors to buy or to use or to carry around. As the Parliamentary Secretary in the Ministry of Education, I appeal to parents and the general public to continue to protect our children. Avoid smoking in their presence. Do not use them to purchase drugs. Do not offer them or ask them to try. Mr. President, we live in a society where a parent may take a glass and give a child to taste alcohol or wine. Or a parent may feel that let my child sniff. But what we are doing is introducing our children to the use of drugs when we do that. And therefore, we all have to take responsibility to ensure that we do not initiate drug use very early in the lives of our children. Because through that, we are contributing to the drug addicts that we have in the society. Mr. President, the Ministry of Education will remain vigilant in ensuring that the children, our children, the children of our nation, are protected against the use of drugs. We will spare no one found to be using the school system for illicit trafficking. And I'm saying this, Mr. President, because I have been there. I have seen it. I have had to call the police, and in many instances around, these young children of school age were aware that this was happening around. And we cannot take it for granted that because we are allowing adults to use a small quantity of cannabis, that it is okay for the children to carry it around. We must understand that it is not okay to, in fact, while we know that as adults, there are many things that are okay for us and are not okay for the children. And drugs are not okay for the children to use. And therefore, I am urging everyone to take care of the children of St. Lucia, protect the children of St. Lucia, and don't make any excuses, because tomorrow we are the ones who have to ensure that our children are safe, and the problems that are caused by use of drugs by our children will be that of the nation. Mr. President, I stand in solidarity with this bill, and I make somebody is laughing. I stand in solidarity of this bill. I thank you.
Senator Jawari.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to make my contribution to this debate for the amendments to the Drug Prevention of Misuse Act, which we first presented in this, well, in the lower house. It came to this lower house, the lower house, about 2 weeks ago. But after the passing of the expungement of records bill 2 weeks ago, I am pleased that this bill is on the table, because to me it says a clear message, it sends a clear message that the St. Lucia Labour Party government really and truly believes in social justice and recognition of the constitutional rights of our people. Now, Mr. President, permit me just for a moment to acknowledge the work of Dr. Rosemary Bell Antoine, who was given the opportunity by CARICOM heads in 2014 to chair the Cannabis Commission to investigate the regulation of cannabis in fellow CARICOM countries. And I believe whilst this started with her, right before the United Workers' Party administration came into power, her strides in this regard cannot go unnoticed. But Mr. President, while some might say that this bill is a long time coming, I have to say that this today, what we are doing today, will go down in history as this Labour Party, St. Lucia Labour Party government makes strides towards social justice and protection of the rights of our people as our constitution will have it. And I will explain as I go on. And so I wish to draw your attention to the proposed amendment of Section 8A, the insertion of a new Section 8A which makes provision for the exemption from criminal liability, Mr. President. When we look at the history of cannabis, we must be made aware, for those who are not aware, that this plant was once legal. In the 1830s thereabout, this plant was once legal. And as a result of the competitive nature of the alcohol industry, cannabis was then classed as in Class A and Class B of other drugs such as cocaine and other drugs. So, Mr. President, my thinking is that it was once legal. Now it is legal. Now we are infringing on the constitutional rights of our people, and it seems like this is not regarded as a serious issue. But I will explain to you why I believe it is absolutely necessary for us to do this at this time. But I just want to say that even as far back as the 1830s, the Americans and the Europeans were using cannabis, and cannabis could have been found and recommended by a doctor. It was found in the stores, and you could go to a doctor, and it would have been recommended. And it is registered. The experiences of doctors that cannabis also contributed to minimizing the pain that persons back then who suffered under the cholera pandemic, who suffered from vomiting and stomach pain, it really helped in easing their symptoms. So I certainly look forward to when we come back to this honorable house to discuss the medicinal regulation of this drug. And I say come back, Mr. President, because I really want us to understand. No pa fair by viti vi. All right? We do not say for something that has been illegal for more than my entire existence, and I'm 33 years old, for more than the existence of our country, which is 42 years old, Mr. President. We are indeed making strides to see that we can go into a positive direction. So we do it today. And of course, I do want to acknowledge the comments of the independent Senator Lee, who did say that the bill needs to provide a bit more clarification as to where we get the drug from. But I do not want to delve into what I believe is the hypocrisy of us pretending to not understand that this indeed exists in our society. But Mr. President, of course, when we see the cultivation or aspects of cultivation of cannabis come before the House, we know that it will be in more detail. So to the Senator, through you, Mr. President, I don't think it's as easy as just a one-liner, because I do believe that it would require a lot of consultation. Notwithstanding the fact that CARICOM countries were commissioned to investigate the regulation of the industry in 2014, and the United Workers' Party came into office in 2016, it still took them 6 years to even come into this house and do anything about it. And of course, they paid lip service to the Rastafarian community. And I just want to draw your quick attention, Mr. President, to our Constitution. Chapter 1 of our Constitution, which speaks to the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms. And under Section 9(1), excuse me, the protection of freedom of conscience, and I will just read. Except with his own consent, a person shall not be hindered in the enjoyment of his freedom of conscience, including freedom of thought and freedom of religion. Freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and both in public and in private, to manifest and propagate his religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. Now, isn't the Rastafarian religion a recognized religion in St. Lucia? But yet still, we have seen, and we saw it on social media, we've seen it in the past, and yes, growing up as a child, I would see Rastafarians being pulled by their hair. I will see how they experience the full force of the law because of a joint. And whether they're from the Heights in Forestier in Peterfloor, or in Marco Bexor, or Dennery, or some parts of this country, they have gone through it. Now, Mr. President, I am not a lawyer, but I do have some understanding of what 30 grams of cannabis will look like. And I believe it's probably a little bigger than my hand, what that might look like. And the amendment that we are putting forward today speaks to that amount per person. So I am not quite sure that this really restricts the Rastafarian community, because this amount of cannabis, I don't know that anybody can possibly smoke that in one day alone. So the argument being made of whether this is sufficient for the Rastafarian community, I stand corrected, but through my discussions with persons of this community, it seems to be sufficient, and they are really pleased and happy with the amendment that is being brought to us today. But Mr. President, further to this, as I said, the St. Lucia Labour Party administration decided that it was a responsible thing to come into this house 2 weeks ago to expand the records of persons, particularly young people, because they represent the majority of our public, who were sentenced to a term of 3 years or less in prison, provided that their release to the public will not put the public in danger and is in the best interest of the public. I thought that was a remarkable achievement for us to do, less than a month in office, to say that we are giving our people a second chance. Mr. President, this bill, this amendment to this legislation is another part, another aspect of this, and can be viewed similarly. We are giving our people a second chance. Can you imagine, Mr. President, on my way to the Senate this morning, I received a call from a very distraught social activist who told me that it was yesterday a 19-year-old young man was stabbed in bodily, and he is currently in critical condition. The family only just found out about that. I am not saying that we are making strides in giving people second chances just because, but with what is going on, these young men continue to find themselves in situations where if they are not given that second opportunity, they might just stay in Body Lake, God forbid, and rot, because we are not taking into consideration the number of them who have been there for just a small amount of cannabis. And Mr. President, like I said, it took 6 years for the opposition, when they were in government, to bring it to the House. But it took the St. Lucia Labour Party less than a month to make it an area of importance, giving people a second chance. Just the same way, last week, we had the Minister of Education make a statement that 4,000 laptops will be distributed to our children of St. Lucia. In less than 1 month, our caring Prime Minister said that our priority has been to protecting our people, giving our people a second chance, addressing the issue of COVID, and of course, taking care of our children and ensuring that they find opportunities to go to school. So, Mr. President, just to give you an example of why we believe these things are so important, we even saw that the bursary assistance, when the government said that there was no money, we had to find the allowance to give parents that relief, where we have children now benefiting from that bursary assistance, and I am one of those who benefited back in 2000 under the St. Lucia Labour Party administration. I know what this means to people. So while some might see this as some simple legislation and this is not a priority, I don't ascribe to that. I do believe that it is a priority. And of course, with the amendments we see here, I believe that it is very responsible of a St. Lucia Labour Party government to include those amendments. And I will direct your attention, Mr. President, to Section 5, which is the insertion of the new Section 14A, which speaks of the treatment and programs for a child or young person. And I do want to note that a change has been made from young offenders to young person who have been found in possession of cannabis. Whilst we are making strides in respecting the rights, and I highlighted of the Rastafarian community, in allowing our people a bit more latitude, as a leader of government business spoke of earlier, that you can now have in your possession maximum 30 grams of cannabis, we are still taking the public health approach in reminding our people that it is not a free-for-all, and it should not under any circumstances be encouraged, or any adult should be encouraging any child to participate in consumption or even possession of cannabis. So there you see, the prudent and responsible thing is that we will have, if a child is found in possession, they will be required to participate in a drug counseling program, approved in consultation with the child, the parent, the guardian. And of course, we want to address those issues whilst they are young. Mr. President, I did address the issue of not fully understanding where the independent senator was coming from when he spoke of the Rastafarian community and the amount and the ability for them to practice publicly. But I also made note of Senator Polius's, through you, comments about this still restricting the Rastafarians in the Rastafarian community. And maybe in the rebuttal of one of her members, they could provide some more clarification on what she really meant by that, because there is a provision in Section 27A under Section 4, Part B2, which reads, establishment except for such area forming part of the establishment as may be specifically designated by the management of the establishment as an area where smoking is permitted. So indeed, there are provisions for smoking to be permitted in public areas. And of course, if this is part of the religious practices of the Rastafarian community, that doesn't mean that they are excluded. They are part of, and if they have designated areas that they smoke in their own community, in their church, I don't know how this bill can be misinterpreted to suggest that they are not included in this at all.
On a point of order, Mr. President, I'm standing on a point of order, 42. Sorry, 41C. The senator did not say, I just want to correct the comment that she made.
Senator, did you say 41C?
Oh, sorry, a point of clarification, yes, 41C. The senator is really misleading the House.
You are referring to the wrong section, Senator.
Which one is it?
The principal is the same, she's misleading us. We want to clarify something.
If you're rising on a point of order, you need to direct the senator as to the contents of the presentation that you take issues with.
A point of clarification. You want to clarify?
Can I proceed?
So, Mr. President, I simply...
On what grounds do you rise, Senator?
It is the statement that the senator made regarding my presentation as it relates to the lack of consideration given to the Rastafarian in the bill. I did not say that the bill was or wrong interpretation, or I was interpreting this to be that the Rastafarians are not being are not being, are being restricted, sorry. That is not what I said. I said that provision should be made, and that should be explicitly stated.
Senators, we can't have both of y'all rising at the same time. So, Senator, you did yield for Senator Paulius to make her contribution. You yielded. Please allow her to continue.
Oh, she's not done. Oh, my apologies.
Continue, Senator.
Senator, sorry, Mr. President, I have already made my point. I just wanted the senator to be very careful that she does not misinterpret what I said and not to mislead the House.
Continue, Senator Shabar.
Thank you, Mr. President, but I'm not sure if the senator is confused by her statements, because she did say that there were no provisions for the Rastafarian community to practice in public spaces. She did say that. So I can move on, Mr. President. As I said, I do believe that this bill comes at a very important time, and the question did come up about whether now is the right time to do it. And I think no time better than the now to give our people a second chance. And I believe that I have made a sufficient argument, especially for our young people who have been incriminated for possession of marijuana in the past, even for possession of a joint, like the independent senator gave an example earlier. And these things still exist. But this bill, this amendment bill, is now saying that we are making strides in the right direction. And again, Mr. President, as I said earlier, I do not believe that because we think the train has left us, that we need to bring everything to the table and do it now. The St. Lucia Labour Party administration has only been in government for about 1 month. We have come under the premise of giving our people a second chance. And of course, I do believe, and as the Prime Minister has stated before, and as the leader of government business stated earlier in his presentation, that we will be back for more discussion. Of course, we are going to talk about cultivation. Of course, we are going to talk about the medicinal value. And of course, we are going to talk about the economic value of introducing cannabis in St. Lucia. But we will do so in a very responsible manner. And Mr. President, of course, I look forward to when that discussion comes. And I just wanted to express my full support for the amendments made, because I believe they are very responsible in terms of the amendments for the Drug Prevention of Misuse Bill. Thank you.
Senator Stanislas.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise in support of the amendment of government business, but of course with a few concerns, Mr. President. And my concerns are very similar to what was articulated by my colleague, Senator Paulius, as well as Independent Senator Lee. Whilst we understand, Mr. President, that we have to live with the times, and the subject of marijuana, decriminalization of marijuana, is on the table and must come to fruition, but we are concerned that the amendment to the bill today is done in sort of a piecemeal manner. And our contention is that probably the government should have brought in the bill in its entirety, because as you're aware, Mr. President, that this is a bill which was already, the cannabis bill was already completed by the former administration, We had the commission set up in 2019 with many consultations by the stakeholders. The draft legislation was already in place and so on. And therefore, I don't think there was anything preventing the government from bringing the entire bill into the House to be enacted. One of the concerns, the bill, of course, is that of the cultivation. The amendment, sorry, doesn't say anything about cultivation. Yes, this bill talks about increasing the amount of cannabis that one could have in their possession from 15 grams to 30 grams. But if John Doe has one plant of marijuana at his home, and that one plant of marijuana is what produces 30 grams, John Doe could still get arrested for growing, for cultivating marijuana. So we're saying, I know in the bill, the cannabis bill itself, cultivation and all of that was part of the bill. We're also saying that the bill itself, the amendment, does not decriminalize marijuana. It is basically to increase the threshold of the amount, the quantity of marijuana you could have in your possession. And that must be specified, that must be made clear. And I'm very happy that the leader of government business alluded to that in his presentation of the bill, because many persons have the perception out there that marijuana has been legalized in St. Lucia or decriminalized. Marijuana has not been decriminalized. This amendment is not decriminalizing or legalizing marijuana. It is only increasing the threshold that an individual could have in his possession and do not get arrested or prosecuted by the law. So that must be very, very clear. And that education campaign, that PR campaign must be a component of this amendment as soon as it becomes law in the operationalization of this amendment, Mr. Speaker. We also consider, Mr. Speaker, that many young people may see this as an opportunity to start smoking marijuana. We all know that marijuana impacts persons in different ways. There are persons who are much stronger mentally, physically, and they will smoke 5, 6 joints for the day, and they're okay. Somebody will smoke half a joint, and it will trigger that individual. And therefore, there must be a massive PR education campaign, I believe, at the school level, Mr. President. Every school, from primary up to the tertiary level, to educate students about the dangers of smoking marijuana and, of course, any other illegal drug out there. But more so, make it clear to them that marijuana is illegal in St. Lucia, and that if they as students are caught with marijuana, there will be consequences with the possession of marijuana, Mr. President. Mr. President, we also concerned that the economic part of the marijuana was not included there, and I heard senators from the other side speaking about process. We all know that there is a process in doing everything, getting everything done, but what we're saying is that there was no need to come here in a piecemeal manner with this amendment, because everything was already there. It was just a matter of bringing the entire bill to the chamber, and we would have gotten this thing done and over with in quick time. But Mr. President, I do support it, the amendment. I believe Rastafarians especially have been stigmatized, they've been persecuted for too long of a time, and other persons who are not Rastas, because a lot of people believe that it's only Rastas who consume marijuana. But there are many, many persons, many professionals, many individuals who would not have even believe or think of. They consume, they smoke marijuana, tea, and so on. So this is a good bill that is going to give people some form of reprieve, that knowing that they can have up to 40 grams of marijuana in their possession, and they will not be prosecuted. Of course, there is this section of the bill. I think it is clause, section 27A, that speaks to smoking in public places. That is another section of the amendment that we need to enforce to ensure that to that particular section, and you cannot be smoking marijuana at any place, at any establishment, when you feel how you feel, because you know there are many persons, especially the elderly, who are not very comfortable with the smell of marijuana or even hearing the word marijuana. So, Mr. President, without any further delay, I would like to support the bill, but register those few concerns, and hopefully the government is to bring the bill, the cannabis bill in its entirety the next time in chambers. I'm talking about the next sitting, but entire cannabis bill, and not tract portions or sections of the bill and come to the Honorable House for
Senator Reynolds.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Before I delve into the matter at hand, Mr. President, for leave to extend my sincere condolences to family members who have lost, to persons who have lost loved ones to the COVID-19, as well as other families who have lost loved ones to other means. And I speak to the family of the young man who drowned earlier this week on Tuesday at the Maki Beach. Also, I extend sympathies to the family and staff of Radio 100 in HTS, Valerie Albert Favry, a media icon, philanthropist, businessman of Babono, Mr. Raphael Elite, the ultimate professional in doing his work in farming, Mr. Keton Jules, violinist, member of Mamai Lakai, and Mr. Arthur Jacob, participating major agricultural icon in theater, sculpture, steel pan, acting, drama. He has gone to meet his friends, the Walcott brothers. May they all rest in peace. And special condolences to Barbara and Lorima and the rest of the family. I also take this opportunity, Mr. President, to wish the students of this country, teachers, principals, education officers, and all stakeholders in the education sector a very successful and productive academic year. I want to say to them, make the best of it. And because education is about making sense of life. And so I commend also to you, Mr. President, the Minister for Education, who's going to make available almost 4,000 devices to the students of this country to aid in their learning and the instruction. So I want to commend him and the government of St. Lucia. As we delve into, Mr. President, the matter before us, I want to acknowledge the presence of the young persons in this Senate space this morning. I had an opportunity to engage with one of them, and I know him to be a very vocal member of the NYC of Student Council. Now, as we talk about marijuana or cannabis. I am happy that we have young people here who can learn, who can open up their minds, learn, and contribute to the discourse at the school level, at the youth, the organization level, etc. And I urge all of us senators here to give the right information so our young people who are here present can take that and go disseminate the right information to their colleagues. And so, Mr. President, I wish to add my voice to the debate on this critical piece of legislation, which is the amendment that's been proposed to the Drugs Prevention of Misuse Bill. Mr. President, there has been much debate and discussion on the topic of decriminalization of cannabis herb locally, regionally, internationally. And as transformational leaders, when people speak to us, we must listen, we must understand, and we must respond appropriately and in a timely fashion. This government, Mr. President, is about putting people first. It's not about lip service. It's taking the necessary action and putting people first. It's funny, Mr. President. During my political campaign in 2011, I was trying to convince a young man to vote for me. He was a very shy student whom I taught in grade 6. Very shy. And he used to follow me all around the school because he felt that I would protect him when I taught him at the time. When I asked for his vote, Mr. President, he said to me boldly that he will vote only when marijuana becomes legal in this country. Mr. President, I moved on. No chance of a TIQA at that time. But we are here now, Mr. President, to consider the process of increasing the possession, the amount of cannabis from 15 to 30 grams for individuals to adults only. Guamun to sell and defined in the curriculum, in the commission report, that when we talk about children and young person, children below the age of 14 are not allowed to have in their possession not one stick, not one pinch of cannabis. Similarly, a young person who is below the age of 18 and above the age of 14 also not allowed to have in their possession any kind of cannabis. So I want the young people to hear this and to understand this. If I can say power, let nous parler about ICA, about marijuana, comme marijuana en monde kay ni. Nous pas ka bay permission pour jeune moun ni marijuana pour yo fumer pour yo faire ça yo vle pi. Non. Nous ka di grand moun seulement si ou 18 ans et mouté ou sani 30 grams marijuana en possession. 30 grams. Si vous c'est 18 ans et en moutant. Si vous c'est 18 ans et en bassa, ou pas ni pièces d'affaires pour ni marijuana en la main ou puis c'est offense criminal. Parti mamay, pas jeune monde. So again, we are putting our young people first. We are being specific in that. And it's not a free for all, Mr. President. We want that to be known. Mr. President, we discussed in our last sitting about the no criminal record. We outlined why this is ever so important, so I will not go into this at this time, Mr. President. But you see, someone may be in possession of a small amount of cannabis for various reasons. Rastafarians for their religious use, sacraments in the space of worship. or recreational for that matter. Some people have it for their own personal use, again, recreational. Medical use, I have known of persons who indicate that it has helped them with whether it be cancer, glaucoma, diabetes, and scientifically, even some of my female colleagues, I have heard with my own ears, Mr. President, that they have said that smoking cannabis helps reduce cramps for them during menstruation. That is their experience. Who am I? And if it helps, Mr. President, for a female, and we always want to push gender balance, the issues of male and female, how it impacts their life. If we are talking here, Mr. President, if it is so for the females, there we go. The St. Lucia's Cannabis Commission Report 2019 identified the various uses and added scientific research. It's strange though, Mr. President. 2019, the previous administration had a copy of the report. On page 10, number 4.1. I'm saying, when I read it, it dawned on me that St. Lucia participated in the research involving the use of cannabis to manage diabetes. Because the commission report stated that scientific research is another reason why people deal with or grow cannabis. But we had an opportunity, Mr. President. Allow me to take you back a little bit. We passed in the lower house the clinical trials bill, it's now an act, in preparation or to collaborate with W Science of Switzerland to set up a diabetes center right here in St. Lucia. The previous government stopped it. They stopped this project. They stopped this process of looking at, setting up rather, a diabetes center in St. Lucia because, and what were the reasons given? The Prime Minister back then, he flaunted. Why do we need this? We know St. Lucians have the second highest rate of incidence of diabetes in the population. Why do we need? We don't need a diabetes center. We do not need anyone to come here and tell us that. I recall, Mr. President, I'm sure you recall too, Mr. President, the way this thing was just thrown out the window. So, Mr. President, we've missed out on an opportunity to have fantastic research conducted here on behalf of the people, to research that would impact the diabetics in this country as it pertains to the impact of cannabis on persons who suffer from diabetes, whether it's beneficial or harmful. We have missed that opportunity for marijuana research because we have high numbers of persons with diabetes in this country. And with the Clinical Trials Act and a diabetes center set up, what a wonderful journey this could have been for St. Lucia. But it was stopped. And, Mr. President, the interest of youth in clinical research, that would have been piqued. Just last week, Mr. President, I saw one of our own sons, I think it's Dulhurst-Croft, a St. Lucian scientist based in Europe, speaking. He works in a lab in a European country, and he was speaking about his experiences as it pertains to the vaccine, viruses, etc. Mr. President, I was so proud of Nigel because, you see, he's a product of St. Lucia, a product of CCSS, my alma mater, and a product of Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, my alma mater again. And he's out there making waves in the international arena. And what is that our young people here in St. Lucia could not have been given such an opportunity right here to do the science in the diabetic center, to conduct such research as it pertains to marijuana or cannabis and as its impact on diabetics. What a wonderful opportunity has been thrown out the window. An indictment on the former United Workers' Party government. You see also, Mr. President, in diabetes.uk indicated that 2 compounds in cannabis, and bear with me as I try, I'm not a medical person, it's cannabidiol, CBD, and tetrahydrocannabivarin, THCV. These have been shown to have benefits for blood sugar control and metabolism in diabetes studies. And right now, Mr. President, in the UK, cannabis products are being made available through the NHS, National Health Service, for people in the UK who suffer from various diseases. And like my independent senator indicated, your train has left. Only this morning, Mr. President, I watched a video coming out of events in Grenadines, where Prime Minister Gonzalez and his cabinet toured a cannabis production facility, well, not but cannabis production facilities, where they grow under controlled conditions, they process the drying, the separate of leaves versus the stalk, and production of health and beauty products. A wonderful process. I see this. Again, we are coming in late, but we can catch up. That's what we are as a St. Lucian people. We are resilient, and we might start late, but we can do good when we jump out there. What pleased me more, Mr. President, was there was over 100 young people who worked in these spaces, and they were very proud and confident to explain to the Prime Minister Gonzalez what was happening in a particular section of this facility. It was a proud moment. And they were able to say to the Prime Minister Gonzalez that they studied agriculture at the college. And we have our young people at Sir Arthur Lewis, North, South, and they are interested in science, chemistry, physics, biology, you name it, and they can do. So again, it's a process. We brought this first phase here today. It's a process. The Prime Minister indicated that it's the first phase of the decriminalization process. So I am trying to understand why people are saying, why would you just bring everything one time? It's a phased approach. It's simple. There's no rocket science to that. It's a phased approach. You did one step at a time. Don't do things in a bullock. So I say to senators, just pace ourselves one step at a time as we inform the population, as people take it one bit at a time, not just throw things at them, but get them enough information to digest one bit at a time. Mr. President, I am particularly pleased with Section A, which speaks to the treatment of programs for a child or young person. Because you see, again, Mr. President, they think it's free for all. They think, some people out there may think the government has opened the floodgates. This is not what it is. Cannabis use by adults. Young people, the treatment programs for young people who may be found in possession of the cannabis. And it reads, Mr. President, where a child or young person is found in possession of cannabis or cannabis resin, he or she shall be required to participate in a drug counseling program approved by the minister, and the child or the adult, the parent or guardian, may be required to make such financial contribution to the program as the minister determines. So we have put it in place, ensuring that our young people are taken care of. So young people will be required to participate in a drug counseling program. I think down the line, Mr. President, the same should be for a young person to be in possession of alcohol, because the situation that we are seeing now, and it's a good thing if we're doing it for cannabis. I think we should do the same. I'm putting this on the table, and let's look at the programs, Mr. President. The Substance Abuse Advisory Council, Secretariat, SACS, it offers drug education programs, primary prevention, and it's youth-focused. And there's a secondary prevention for young people with some habitual use. So we're not just putting this in there, Mr. President, to just tell people we're doing programs and treatment. It is actually happening. That is there already through the Substance Abuse Advisory Council Secretariat. And these programs are free. Hence the reason why Bill speaks to the parents may be required to make a financial contribution. It also gives the parent that responsibility to oversee what your child is up to. If you know your child is going to attend a counseling session, you know you're required to make a financial contribution, you check your business. You watch your child. You protect your child from cannabis use and alcohol use and abuse. Other drug education programs at the primary and secondary schools, like the life skills, health and family life programs, that deal with self and interpersonal relationship, coping with risk, adversity, teaching young people refusal skills, how to say no when there's peer pressure to engage in cannabis use, negotiation skills with their peers, for example, and also to analyze the impact of alcohol and other illicit drugs. So the programs are there, but we need more. We need these to be more effective. We need these to be more robust. We need our teachers to be better trained, to be able to deliver, not teach, but deliver those programs with confidence. And there's also the Ask, Listen, and Learn program at the school level. These programs, or this program, focuses on reducing the incidence of underage drinking and to promote healthy lifestyle. Again, I submit, Mr. President, that it should include use of cannabis. Focus on reducing the incidence of underage use of cannabis. So it's for alcohol, but I want to put it here today that it should include use of cannabis. It also deals with the impact of alcohol on the brain. Again, I submit it should include cannabis use for similar reasons. There are programs, there must be programs for cannabis prevention that we must implement quickly and effectively, and I agree with Senator that there must be public education. There is also the turning point, talks and treatment services, as Senator from Sufre referred to. Some people may be able to use cannabis, one, and mental health problems. I recall very seriously a conversation that I had with either the Chief Medical Officer of Jamaica some time ago, Mr. President, and he said the way it was implemented in Jamaica, maybe one go, and the structures were not in place, Mr. President, and it caused a whole backlog because young people or other people who stepped out and tried it, it is now, legalized, etc. We saw a lot of people coming up with mental health issues. So here's the reason why I so agree for us to do this in a phased approach, not just one go, because we need the structures, we need the resources for what might be a backlash. So we have Turning Point, the detox and treatment services for persons who are addicted to alcohol and cannabis. We have the Mental Wellness Center, and I add and put on the record again, Mr. President, that this Millennium Heights Medical Complex was a project of the St. Lucia Labour Party government. We have the OKEU Hospital, the Turning Point Drug Rehabilitation Center, the Mental Wellness Center. All these three were conceived by former Prime Minister Dr. Kenny D. Anthony, and the project started under the St. Lucia Labour Party. We finished up to the last one, the OKU. We transitioned the patients from Latok into those facilities at Cuba Rail. So our cannabis reports, Mr. President, speaks to public health, prevention, and treatment. I wish to suggest, and of course, on the government side, we need to look at this, that there be an increase in allocation for staffing and funding for the Drug Secretariat the next financial year. 3 staff members again. A government just left, 5 years, 5.5 years, never saw Eastern working in a drug abuse secretariat. And a lot of the support came from regional and international organizations like PAO, WHO, OAS, etc. And sometimes I know, Mr. President, you wonder why go there, but we must not forget, Mr. President, that a lot of the resources to deal with drug abuse for this institution came from regional and international organizations. What was the role of the government then? How much did they allocate to that? And now we are seeing, not now, but when we look at the amount of money that went to agencies out of St. Lucia and, foreigners, as compared to having 3 staff members in an organization to deal with the issues affecting young people. So definitely, Mr. President, more resources are needed urgently. Because as you see, and even a few years ago, countries in the OECD given the status of developing countries. The international organizations are saying you can manage, you have resources. So they have cut down on the amount of financial support they would give to countries like St. Lucia because we have the status of developing countries. And so, Mr. President, they will give their resources to Africa, countries in Africa, to Haiti, and so St. Lucia will miss out and other countries will miss out. This is a fact, Mr. President. I have sat in meetings and hear directors of international agencies, we have reached that status, and so they cut down on what we can do. So we need to find ways of getting our own resources to deal with our issues. And so not all international agents are prepared to fund everything for us. The Commission report on cannabis, Mr. President, identifies high-risk groups, youth who can be impacted by cannabis. The protection of our young people with mental health, these are the vulnerable people that they speak of. They focused on health and well-being of the vulnerable people, the small farmers, the marginalized Rastafarians, etc. And I'm also happy, Mr. President, that the bill spoke to smoking or non-smoking cannabis in the public space. They structured the bus, bars, clubs, restaurants, etc. Before, time and time again, the secondhand smoke will affect or can affect persons who are here. Mr. President, I want to share with you my own experience, or experiences for that matter. As a student undertaking postgrad studies, I had to visit a club in South London to see what was happening with monstrations away from home, as I studied migration, where is home. And as a researcher, I mean, it's club life, Mr. President, so you dress up and you enter the club. And Mr. President, it was after the volcanic eruptions over there, and there was weed smoking all over. In fact, Mr. President, they're smoking more than they were drinking. It's like the club was a club for weed. And it was a closed space because it's cold outside, so we were closed in, and there was so much smoking going on. And at the time, Mr. President, it was illegal. So Russians found a safe space within which to smoke. And like similarly, in St. Lucia, persons who wish to smoke have to find a safe space. I was not there to smoke, but I had to do what I had to do. But Mr. President, when I left there, I had to just hose myself down. And similarly, I don't know how many of us attended the Lucky Dube concert at Marshall Grounds a few years ago, the deceased Lucky Dube. And Mr. President, it was open space, but the Rastafarians, oh, they were in their glory. Mr. President, I don't know whether I was a Rastafarian too, because I inhaled so much weed that night, Mr. President, and they were happy. I saw how it feels, you know. And that I can tell you, I know with that bill being amended being.
Senator, may I ask, were you happy as well?
No, Mr. President. I was just explaining to you, describing to you the situation and how I know Rastafarians would feel with that bill being passed in that first phase here. Also, and my learned senator alluded to that earlier when he spoke about persons coming into the country for the sun, for food, for adventure. And again, on another flight from London, Mr. President, I'm sitting next to a Caucasian male and his partner. And they were engaged in an argument to the point that the young lady began to cry. And the young man turned me, Mr. President, and asked me whether I could direct him to a space in St. Lucia where he could purchase money. I was horrified at the time, Mr. President. But you see, I stood the young man because at the time I was wearing twists, or it looked like locks. So he probably thought I was a Rastafarian or dread, and that I was engaged in marijuana. It is true that persons come from developed countries to have sun, the alcohol, and the weed. Again, what do? The 30 grams for recreation, for their personal use in their private space. So, whether it's in their home, in the yard.
Senator, you have 15 minutes left.
Thank you, my wrapping up. In the compound, in the temple, whether it's to make tea, the cleansing space, like they do, like the sacraments, it's for adults' use. And I heard the conversation or the discussion about the number of plants allowed, etc. And I heard the discourse in the lower house, Mr. President. I know the commission report speaks to about 6 plants allowed, and I heard the discourse in the lower house, and it was proposed maybe 4 plants to start off. So I know that we will back here to look at cultivation, or how many plants would be allowed in someone's backyard, etc. So I say I have no fear, senators. This will be dealt with very, very soon. So, Mr. President, once again, I want to register my support for the amendments proposed for this bill, and of course endorse the point that education is ever so important. In English, ek lang mamanou en créole, même si pas tout le monde comprend, mais anglais et créole pour tout grand monde et tout jeune monde ça comprendre qui ça nous a dit à Kaila ici. Mr. President, I rest my case. I thank you.
Senator Fede.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise very briefly to just add a few comments to the debate that's taking place in the chamber this morning. Mr. President, before I do so, I beg leave of you to express my most heartfelt condolences to the families, multiple families who have lost loved ones due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Speaker, some of these families I know personally, and it's really a very painful thing to have experienced. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask you as well to allow me the latitude to also underscore the most urgent and dire need why the government must act now to solve this whole issue of COVID-19 so that we can protect many more lives in St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, marijuana cultivation has been cited for quite some time as a possible replacement to struggling small economies of the Caribbean, for a replacement to rural economies which are displaced because of the banana production. Mr. Speaker, you would recall very well that as bananas struggle to cope with the new era of globalization and tribalization, that countries of the Caribbean who depended on this cash crop were looking for an opportunity to replace a displaced economy. I remember that the Prime Minister of St. Vincent, Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, made his voice sounded very loudly and suggested that marijuana was a great alternative and that we had to look at a possibility of engendering a space where this can become a more significant contributor to the economy of the Caribbean at that time. So this is going back 20 odd years that the Caribbean has been having this discussion. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to today salute the Rastafarian community for their vehement protests to the laws in our country which were clearly archaic and didn't keep up with the times. And the laws, Mr. President, would have certainly discriminated against their own religious beliefs and their own contention at that time that the marijuana and the herb plant was very important and central to their own religious freedoms. And so today I want to salute them for that significant contribution to our democracy. Very often, Mr. President, the good ideas and the evolution of society doesn't necessarily come from government, but it comes from civil society. It comes from the very long-standing and incessant debate that we have seen by the Rastafarian community and others in our country to ensure that our laws come up to the time. Mr. President, I must tell you that in the constituency of Ancillary Canneries, which I had the pleasure to represent, it is open secret that the level of production is very, very high. And I know personally a number of individuals who would be rejoicing and celebrating as we inch closer to that time, because how a lot of people are making their living. It's a reality in our country. And so I know for a fact that many small farmers are going to the whole concept and principle of us getting closer and closer to creating a space that would allow for the production and the export and trading of marijuana, which is central to their own sustenance and existence. Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, I'm sorry. It then baffles me the approach that this government is taking to this bill. Because, Mr. President, you would recall that there are many discussions, there was a report, a lot of studies, plus the incessant debates that were taking place. But there was actually a commission set up by the previous administration. And that commission had a representative from the opposition, a person of the now Minister of Health and member for Viewfort North, Honorable Musa. And so, Mr. President, the opposition should be acutely aware of all of the issues and all of the various contentions which would have preoccupied the various discussions on cannabis. Those consultations, Mr. Speaker, actually allowed a bill to be developed. And I know that the AG's office had completed that bill. And that bill, Mr. Speaker, is ready to come to the House for debate and implementation. So I think that the government would need to explain this piecemeal approach that they are taking to the whole approach of marijuana and the decriminalization of it. So while as an opposition we do agree that this is something that is absolutely necessary because of the evolution of our society and where we are and the infringement of the Rastafarian community to have their religious rights, I am baffled. Why this approach? Why come rush? The government claims that it's only been in government some months, some say weeks. It confuses my calendar. But why rush, Mr. Speaker, to bring a piece of paper to expunge your records and make it legal for some people to be in possession of it, and then it's not legal for people to import, nor it's not legal for people to produce it. I mean, this is causing confusion, and this is a gross representation of what the St. Lucia Labour Party stands for, a party of confusion. So, Mr. President, I am baffled. Why this approach? Why not bring the completed bill, which the Labour Party would have had input in putting together? Because of your representation on the commission, you would have been aware of the various consultations. Bring the bill so that we can have a very, very comprehensive approach to this very, very, very important step in our country's development. Mr. President, Jamaica has just, a few years ago, they have cited that there's drug abuse increase since the passage of the legislation to decriminalize marijuana in their jurisdiction. And so we're dealing with some very serious matters. So yes, it is right and good and proper for us to make sure that we allow Rastafarian community the religious freedom to be able to use the marijuana plant. It is good and proper for us to have the marijuana plant as an alternative for economic development in our country. Yes, fine. But we also have to take the time to make sure that we do this properly, that we do the work. I heard the Senator and the former Minister of Health mention that we need to appropriate more funds to better staff the drug abuse unit or the institution to manage drug abuse. The senator can clarify if she wants to. But, Mr. President, it underscores the fact that we're not ready, the fact that we have not taken the time to do the proper work and to put the infrastructure in place. So to say that you will now have a very confused piece of legislation which collides with other pieces of legislation, clearly, and to come into non-requisite preparation and the infrastructure in place tells me that this is not only piecemeal, but this has not been well thought out. So there's a danger when you try to play politics, and there's a danger when you try to keep election promises at all costs. And we're seeing this, Mr. President, with the way that this government continues to manage COVID. Everything is political. They're waiting on the science. They support the state of emergency. They didn't while they were in opposition. They called to close the borders. Now, no, it's okay. It's absolutely necessary. So there has been mass confusion and duplicity, and the people of St. Lucia continues to lose confidence in this administration day by day because, Mr. President, they are not only flip-flopping on the various issues, but what they do, Mr.
Senator Reynolds.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise on the point of order because I think the senator is misleading. That the infrastructure is not in place. Mr. President, I think I outlined a range of programs and offices and departments in secondary, primary, secretariats, facilities that are in place. I only said we must increase the staffing of drug abuse secretariat. That is all I said. But I didn't say the infrastructure was not in place. I outlined a complete range. So please be advised on him, Senator.
Senator Fede, how do you respond?
Well, thank you, Mr. President. In their own words, there you have it. We need more staff for the drug abuse secretariat. What else must I say? That is an important part, that you're going to now put hands in the marijuana people, and you don't have enough employees to make sure that the requisite programs are in place. Then how do you go forward? How do you then justify
Reynolds,
the fact that you have everything
Senator
in
Reynolds,
place and it is
Senator
perfect
Fede,
what you're doing?
Senator Reynolds,
The naughty corner for you, Mr. President? You want me to implement the naughty corner? I'm hearing you calling on Senator, but he's not hearing. Mr. President, I am repeating. I've indicated that the range on the point of order that the senator continues to mislead and misinterpret what I've said. I indicated a range of programs and facilities that are already in place to deal with treatment and counseling for children or young persons and adults who may need those services. He continues to say the structure, and what will it take for the Honorable Senator to get it and understand my words?
Senator Fede, I allowed you sufficient leeway to make your points. It's quite clear, lucidly clear, that of the programs that the senator had mentioned during her presentation previous to her point of order, her objection. She did state the Turning Point facility, the mental wellness facility, and there were some other facilities. If it is that your argument is that it is not sufficient, you can say that. But it is disingenuous of you to say that there's absolutely no preparation was made. So I do agree with the senator and you may conclude accordingly. Please be guided in your approach.
Thank you, dear. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, the point must still be made. We are moving in an era where this is a landmark step for our country. The various institutions that the senator would have mentioned, do they have any experience in dealing with the resultant effects on young people that would come about because of abuse? We are now coming here, and we are doing so before beefing up facilities, and by the senator's own admission, she said that need to appropriate more funds so that we can staff the drug abuse unit at the institution that she quoted, so that we can be better ready. That's what she said. These are not my words. These are the senator's words. She said that with more staff. So why come, make it legal, and you don't have the staff? This is worrisome. And this is my point. This is what I'm saying to you. So the various institutions, Turning Point, they deal with people
Senator Reynolds.
Who alcohol abuse.
Senator Reynolds has indicated.
Point of elucidation.
Mr. Speaker, I do not yield.
Mr. President.
Can I? I'm not yielding to elucidation.
Point of order.
You may rise on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. President. Just to inform that the Point Drug Abuse Facility deals with persons who are addicted to marijuana, alcohol, and other drugs. The drug secretariat deals with prevention programs, secondary programs for young people. So facilities are to deal with prevention, counseling, as well as detoxification and other therapies. Just for the minutes, the senator's information.
Yes, your point of order is in fact in order, because you did highlight the areas of the Senator Fade's presentation that you took. Is correct. For your own benefit, Senator Stanislas, she is correct. She is raising the point of order. Yes, he did respond. Go ahead, Senator Fade.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, again, we are coming into this House. We are trying to convince the country that we have done the necessary work to amend the staffing levels that are going to be requisite. Now, Mr. President, the floodgates are going to be open, because we're saying now that it's legal for people to smoke marijuana in public places. And this is what this legislation is saying. You can now have in your possession. And so once you can have this in your possession for personal use, you've now made it easier for people to be able to possess marijuana. And so now people can use it for recreational purposes. So, Mr. President, therefore, forgive me if I am very worried that we're taking this big step, but then a government senator is going to say that her own government needs to put more staffing in place. That worries me tremendously, Mr. President. And so this is the point, that if this has not been thought about before, then this points to an unreadiness by this government to get this program implemented properly. And so that's my thing, right? If it is that you have done all the research, and don't tell me you've been there because you came here with a bill. This is your amendment. You are saying you are now ready to implement a piece of legislation that would allow people 30 grams in possession from 15 to 30 grams. You're increasing the amount that people can now have in their possession. And now, in the same token, you're saying that we need to appropriate ready. This then endorses what my colleagues have been saying, that this is absolutely piecemeal. And what we need to do is to go back to the drawing board. You have been part of the commission. Bring the comprehensive legislation that is already been done. It's written. If you haven't, then take your time. Take a few months and then bring a proper piece of legislation so that you can give the population the surety that you have taken the time and you have done this properly. In other instances, when we've called on you to deal with COVID, which is a more pressing crisis, to run and get it done because of the supersonic speed with which COVID-19 is spiraling, you say to us you've only been there for 6 weeks, right? But yet you bring this bill and you're not ready to manage it properly. And so, Mr. President, I submit to you that the St. Lucia Labour Party administration has always been a government of talk. The senator, who is the former Minister of Health, in her presentation, and I referenced it again, said that it is an indictment on the UWP administration that we did not implement the diabetes lab, but failed to tell the country that she has been Minister of Health, and if it was important to her, why didn't she implement it? Why didn't she ensure, why didn't the senator ensure that the diabetes lab was implemented in her tenure, knowing very well, now I'm tourism, she was the lead ministry on health. That's point of order. So she was the lead minister of health. This is her line ministry. And so I submit to you, Mr. President, it is more an indictment on her that she didn't do it. Because if it was important to her, Mr. President, she would have done it. This is my point.
Senator, please refer to the member in his senatorial capacity. It's not him or her.
Oh, we are not dealing with genders. No problem. I have no problem with that, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, I want to tell you today that I'm about the approach that I see that this government is taking with this piece of legislation. I am happy for one thing that we're recognizing the hard work of the Rastafarian, and we're recognizing, and there is certainly bipartisan support for the economic development contribution that cannabis can make to the evolution of our society. But I have a fundamental problem with how this is being implemented, and that is the piecemeal approach is absolutely not necessary. Mr. President, I heard in various parts of the debate that we need to protect the small farmers from the bigger operators or bigger business people or larger commercial interest that may come and seize the opportunity away from our farmers who have been fighting and clamoring for this bill for quite some time. Now, that's a very good intention. And it's a very good point. But, Mr. President, I want to caution this House that we must be careful not to raise a certain expectation that might not be possible. Because we are signatories to the World Trade Organization. We're signatories to the CARICOM Single Market and Economy. What is going to stop a Jamaican manufacturer or producer from coming to invest in St. Lucia? What is going to stop someone from, I'll use one of the states, Colorado, where I think the marijuana production is legal, from coming to invest in Lucia? What are we going to say to them? So I want us to be realistic in some of the pronouncements that we make, so that we don't raise false expectations. Let's do the proper research to make sure that we are able to have the right framework. I would rather to hear, Mr. President, that we're going to support the farmers with very strong management structures in the science and the cultivation and production of the marijuana plant, as well as in marketing, in product development, in administration, in shipping, in exports, in packaging, and all of the things that maybe a small farmer would not be able to do on his own. So when this opportunity comes around, that the small farmers are not pushed out of it, but the small farmers are indeed, Mr. President, empowered by our collective will to make sure that they are ready for the world of commerce, and we so push them forward. And so the aspiration of building an economy out of this can be realized. It is impossible for us to raise the expectation that they should be protected, and that might be legally and commercially do so. This is a world today of markets, and we have to make sure that we empower our farmers to compete and be competitive, train them up, and to give them the necessary support. SMEs in agriculture have found it extremely difficult to get financing, and I would like to know when the bill comes, I would like to see a corresponding plan from the government to see how we tend to deal with that issue that confronts many small businesses, particularly in the area of agriculture, to see how do we get over that hurdle that currently exists for financing for SMEs. The banks are very, very tight, extremely rigorous, and so these are the problems that we can down the line, and I hope that the government is actually considering those issues and making sure that development, for example, might be empowered to be able to fund some of these projects. Agriculture needs capital, and it's a science, and the farmers will need help. And so I'm looking forward to hear what the government says about that. The Rastafarian community, I don't think that enough justice is done in this bill to the great work that they have done. And they have done an extraordinary job, as I've cited in the earlier part of our discussion. And I agree with Senator Polius when she indicated that not enough attention and due care was placed on the fact that they need to have been mentioned in this bill, or with specificity. There's a very vague mention here about in section 27 about public places, and we believe that when it comes to the whole thing of the religious freedoms that the Rastafarians need to have and deserve, that mentioned with greater specificity in this bill, and don't leave it to very vague and open up this thing to various interpretations, and which could potentially find some Rastafarians on the wrong side of the law, depending on who the judge is. So we would say, Mr. President, to make sure that this is tightened up and the vagueness is removed and the specifics is included as it relates to the rights and freedoms of Rastafarians to actually use the bill. And so, Mr. President, I will start as I will end as I've started. And that is, Mr. President, that we support this principle. We were the ones who did the commission. We were the ones who invited the opposition to come and sit and let us put some legislation in place. We never anticipated that this piecemeal approach would be brought here. And so it is a very sad day after all that work that was done, that we see a piece of paper coming to the Parliament with more confusion rather than helping the situation, because this doesn't do anything to legalize exports, it doesn't do anything to legalize production, but it now allows people to have quantities. So what we're doing is encouraging people to break the law either by production or break the law either by imports. How are people going to get it into the hands remains a very, very looming question. So, President, I thank you very much for the time that you've allowed me, and I thank the House very much for their indulgence.
Senator Shari.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise in support of the amendment before us. It would be remiss of me, and I know my good friend Shay, who for years has had this conversation with me, would not forgive me if in fact I did not lend my voice to this bill in question. I draw particular attention to section 8A, the addition of 8A, which looks at the exemption from criminal liability for persons found in possession of 30 grams. And as a young person myself, I cannot not stand up in support of amendment and not pay close attention to that section, because it is too often the understanding that these things otherwise considered little have far-reaching consequences for our young persons. Young persons who, because of possession of small quantities, 15 grams, half a ounce, have been left to live the rest of their lives not having been able to explore their full potential as a human being, because they carry around this weight of a record, a criminal record. And so I applaud very much this amendment. I have sat here and I have heard the word criminal approach being used so much in the debate. And it has really gotten me to jog back a bit. And it has been said many times in this honorable house that seem to be blessed with a lot of educators. And I myself have done my own STEAM classroom, albeit not much younger ones, but I have 2 children. And one of them left kindergarten not so long ago. And so I'm pretty sure many of us educators inside of here, we can remember, and tell me out, Senator Pauline, if I'm wrong, but one of the very things our children in kindergarten is processes. I remember not too long ago being in kindergarten myself, and I learned how to do a lemonade. And we were told, first you gather the ingredients, then you cut the lemons, then you squeeze the lemons. And so it simply speaks to the fact that in everything we do, there are processes and there are steps. And so when a governmental Labour Party, that the research has been done, it has been understood that this is something that we have to face head on when it comes to the decriminalization of marijuana. And so that government, in its wisdom under the leadership of Philip J. Pierre, decides that we are going to start somewhere. And he did indicate, the Prime Minister did indicate in his presentation that the other aspects will follow. But it is disingenuous of us to stand here and speak of a piecemeal approach as if as adults we do not understand that we were once children who grew from stride to stride before we can become adults. And as lawmakers, we need not mislead our people into believing that we can just drop everything into a bucket and then everything will be nice and glory. I think this legislation, this amendment gives us an opportunity as a country, an opportunity as lawmakers to assess a step at a time as we go along and to determine what are the next pieces of that report that we can now add in. Because we can well understand that change change will happen. And even we might find that in the next few years, that very report of the Cannabis Commission, many aspects of it may become null and void, obsolete, and there will be a need to change. There will be a need to amend. There will be. I take offense in that word being bandied around in terms of piecemeal. Something else that jumped at me was decriminalization. We've thrown decriminalization around, and Senator Stanislaus, I think, was the one who mentioned that. Decriminalization simply is a reclassification of the law. That is what decriminalization is. And so we say that it is not decriminalization in its true sense, the way this amendment is presented. But if we understand what decriminalization in itself means, then we understand that to move from half an ounce of 15 grams to 30 grams, it is in itself a form of decriminalization, and the rest will follow. I do agree that the other aspects will create the holistic approach that we want to look at in perhaps developing an industry around marijuana. And one of the things that stood up obviously is the cultivation of the weed. But let us not be hypocritical about what exists. With 15 grams being the legal allowable quantity that you can possess, our people have been getting it. Senator Fede mentioned that it is planted and cultivated in expanses in his constituency of Ancillary. And so, well, his former constituency that he represented in Ancillary. And so the reality is that it has been there. It has been grown. And so let's not be hypocritical about what the truth is. I grew up in a rural community. I still live in a rural community. Thankfully, I do not recall many instances where my own community, where we had such a problem with marijuana. But as a child growing up, at the time, not even knowing that the community of Grace was within the same constituency with me, so often I assumed that I shared a constituency with Senator Ferdinand. But even just during the week and after this legislation was being talked about in the media and so on, I had the opportunity to speak with a few young men from the community of Grace, a community by our own recollection, we know to have been a community where a lot of persons were involved and perhaps still are. I do not want to follow the lead of Senator Fede and perhaps expose the disease. But the truth is that we know that a lot of persons within that community, a lot of young persons lost opportunities because of the treatment of the 15 grams and other quantities. We know a lot of parents who send their children to school that way. These people are good standing citizens now. And so for us to now give them an opportunity to start up the process of making the processes, putting the processes and the structures in place to eventually an industry, create an industry perhaps out of marijuana and weed, I think it's a good step and a step in the right direction. And again, a step that only a caring St. Lucia Labour Party government would have the tenacity and the fortitude to actually bring to this honorable house to begin that process. Of course, it follows suit in the whole philosophy of the St. Lucia Labour Party to have understood, and we have, you know, it's politics, they play in politics and so on, but the reality is that politics, in the raw sense of the word politics, guides all of our existence in this country. And so, of course, it follows the lead of the St. Lucia Labour Party in including those perhaps considered the most vulnerable, those perhaps considered not otherwise having a voice, the parents who otherwise would not have been able to send children to school, who can now confidently be able to do that without these children being shamed that my parents have not paid facilities fee, because the Lucia Labour Party promised and led the charge in delivering that to the people of St. Lucia. And so I stand confident here, knowing that the St. Lucia Labour Party, a party of inclusion, a party of freedom and justice, is now bringing justice to the many young people, the Rastafarians, like we have said before in this honorable house this morning, who have otherwise been relegated to the sidelines and labeled for the use of marijuana and the possession of marijuana. And so I think it is a step in the right direction. Misuse in Jamaica, who had gone full-fledged and implemented the use, the cultivation and so on of marijuana. And whereas he states that this government is taking a piecemeal approach, he has actually underpinned the fundamental reason for not just jumping into it, a pagal and any money, because our neighbors have had an experience. It's an experience that I think it's better taken in strides. And in almost every facet of life, you go to the doctor tells you that this is what is wrong with you. A lot of the time, they do not give you a regimen of medication. We take it in strides. We try the paracetamol out first, and then it doesn't work too well. We go back to the doctor and we reconsult the books until we understand what the real issue is. We consult, and as we do that, we change, we make amends. Again, I want to acknowledge the aspect of the legislation that looks at the support services. And we've all acknowledged that it's important that we protect our young people. We protect persons who, based on a particular age, should not be engaged in the use of marijuana. And so the legislation speaks to support for these people in terms of counseling, in terms of rehabilitation. And of course, I am in full support of that section. I know one of the burning issues, and it has been mentioned before this morning, is use. And in terms of being able to have these safe spaces. And I want to urge our people, I want to urge our users of marijuana, our users of the ganja and the weed, that having been given the leeway, the level of liberty to have your possession and use a little more, also comes with a responsibility to ensure that you do not infringe upon the right of your fellow St. Lucians. And I think if perhaps we can understand this, and if we can work together in the space that is created for us as fellow St. Lucians, then we can well see our way into being able to, in a shorter space of time, bring on the other aspects that will complete that legislation. Just before I sit, I want to make mention of something else that jumped out at me in terms of the former administration did not come to enact this piece of legislation because they were looking at the big picture. And my question is, what big picture? Is it the big picture that left these very young people who have been incarcerated, who have been labeled, who have been denied their fair space in society? Is it that big picture that left them behind? These very young people who are sitting in Bodily, who cannot currently lend their voice to such a piece of legislation. And so we have to promote social inclusion when we look at legislation that affect our people. Permit me some leave, Mr. President, to acknowledge September as Awareness Month for Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome. As a young lady, I understand that it may be something that is really under society, polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS, as many of us know it. And it's a hormone disorder that affects women and girls. And so I think it's fitting for me at this juncture to recognize that September PCOS Awareness Month, and to perhaps bring to the fore and to perhaps to begin to bring to the minds of our legislators that it is important for us to look into diseases like these that affect our young women and girls, and to start to put the necessary processes, the necessary support systems in place to support them, and to ensure that some of the issues that are created by diseases like these do not continue to affect our ability as women to continue to contribute wholly to our society. So again, I just want to reiterate my support for this amendment, Mr. President, and again to applaud the government for seeing it necessary to take what perhaps could not have been done in the last 6 years, albeit in part or in its entirety, but to begin a process of change and social inclusion in our 238 square mile. I thank you.
The Leader of Government Business.
Mr. President, I move for the suspension of this Honorable House for 1 hour, please.
Senator, the question is that this sitting be suspended until 20 past 2. The question, as many as of this opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
All right.
And we've seen the suspension of the Senate as the senators break for lunch for the next hour, and we've been listening to debate on the drugs prevention and misuse amendments to that bill, which will make it possible for Lucians to now have upward 30 grams of cannabis as personal possession. We also saw that the Lucia Parliament some week and a half or 2 weeks ago made allowances for the ex-records individuals who have been convicted of possession of small quantities of marijuana. All of this, the government of St. Lucia has indicated, is in keeping with a larger plan, and is with the establishment of a cannabis industry. And certainly what government is doing at this time is taking things one piece at a time and dealing with various aspects of the established industry to ensure that there's a comprehensive approach on the ground. Primus fundamentally in this bill included in the amendments the provision for individuals to be able to access service when it comes to the treatment, especially young individuals. And also this does not allow for a free-for-all in terms of individuals being able to just smoke anywhere in public, while there may be duly constituted areas for smokers, but this does not allow for individuals to be free to smoke. Later on, when the House reconvenes